So I'm Murray Oldfield, the other guy's Luca. I realised that, how many people were in the session previous to this one in the same room? So probably a third. So the previous session was an introduction to InterSystems Cloud Manager and talked a little bit about the concepts and why you might want to use it. So this is a pretty deep question, but we'll just go zoom down to the next 45 minutes or so. So around the conference, you're going to see sessions about containers and using infrastructure as code and so on. So what my journey with InterSystems Cloud Manager was, I work as a technology architect, so I work in a group that does a lot of benchmarking and working with vendors. So for example, we do benchmarks on new infrastructure that comes out, like hyperconverged storage, or we run benchmarks up in the cloud on AWS to understand the profile of the various components and things. So one of the challenges I always have is actually deploying the Iris infrastructure for the benchmark itself. So when ICM came out, I was probably an early adopter because I actually had a job to do that involved deploying Iris for the testing. So what I'm going to talk about over the next little while is my workflow, how I did it, how I learned where to start, because that's the biggest challenge. When you come into these things, you don't know what you don't know. So yeah, there's documentation, but how do I actually get this thing up and running? So as we step through, I'll start explaining some of the concepts and my workflow. And if you've got any questions, certainly I don't mind you asking them as we go through. And I'll try my best, or Luca will answer them, and we'll also have time at the end for that as well. So what we're looking for, I wanted to start deploying my Iris applications. Whether it's a single instance or a distributed cluster or shards or whatever it is, but in a DevOps sort of way. And what DevOps really means is a repeatable way, a way that's managed properly, and to be honest, gets the humans out of the picture. If you've ever had to spin something up in the cloud on AWS and gone through the GUI interface, you click this and you click that, and you can't be doing that when you're deploying 2 nodes or 3 nodes. That's painful enough. But if you're deploying 5, 10, some other number, it's really going to get on your nerves. So that's why we've got InterSystems Cloud Manager. So what we did is we developed InterSystems Cloud Manager because as we go into Iris, and as you saw in the presentations this morning, these things are getting more complex in that we're deploying more instances just for a single application. And we need a way to do this, and also so what we need to do is provision those VMs and provision that virtual private cloud or whatever. But also we need a way to connect together all the Iris pieces, whether you're using ECP or mirroring or application servers. So this is a way of bundling that stuff up and making it much more driven by this idea of infrastructure as code. So in its current form, it's a command line driven interface, and I believe we're going to be going more and more to the API, but the thing with the command line is that you can start to script these things as well. And we can provision containers, as I'm pretty sure you would be aware, from AWS, Azure. You can also deploy on bare metal and on vSphere as well. And because everybody else at these sessions is showing you Azure and Google Cloud and AWS, I'm going to actually do my demonstrations on vSphere. Now, what that means is that the methodology is pretty much the same, and what I'm trying to show you too is that your target can be in multiple places. So not just deploying to AWS. More and more today, people are splitting their availability across multiple zones and multiple clouds. So we want to be agile and we want to be able to do these things as well. So, sort of back to square one, why containers? We'll see this over and over again. How many people at the moment are deploying applications, any applications in containers? So, at a guess, half the room. How many people are deploying, Cache or Iris in a container? A couple. So we're starting along that process. So people are starting to learn about it, starting to learn the advantages. I use it personally, not just for Iris, but I do work on writing Python stuff for the performance. And so instead of people trying to install Python and this and that, we use a container. So the idea of a container is it's this read-only image which contains everything that the application needs, all the application code. The data is separate, and we'll get onto that in a minute, but the idea is that I could give you this in test, and then we move the same container to dev and to user acceptance testing, and ultimately you can go to production, and it's the same all the way. There's no dependencies that were forgotten, no library that was left out. So that's why people are starting to go to this container. Now I work with benchmarking as well, so I care about things like, well, what's the I/O performance and things like that, and you really don't, you don't lose anything by running stuff in containers that way either. So it's more about just changing the way you operate. So as we go through for ICM, I'm going to talk about how we deploy it, configure it, define it, and then I'm going to sort of like a where next, and what other things should you talk about. The key is that ICM itself is deployed in a container. So when you download it, you get it in a container. So I'm going to just show you a demo. So this is a vSphere system. We've got a resource group there called cluster-wide, which is that thing that's a little, and I'm going to deploy Iris onto this vSphere infrastructure. You notice I've got no hands on the keyboard because I'm not insane enough to try and do a live demo in front of you. So here we are, we're inside the ICM container. I say ICM provision, stuff happens. And it's starting to connect to some number of, to that resource group. Now, if this was AWS, it would be connecting to to AWS and starting to create a virtual VPC. You can see that it's already started creating some VMs, and things will speed up now, and we'll see that other stuff happens, and we're racing forward in time. It's copying files over. It was doing an SSH connection, but it timed out as the VM was starting up, so it just keeps trying. We're mounting some volumes. We've created some actual volumes in VMware, and we've installed everything, and there it is. So this is all up and running now. It was deploying, in this case, 3 VMs, a data master and a couple of shards. And that was all coming from some definition files, which I'll show you in a minute. And you can see how powerful that is. And so I provisioned the hardware, these 3 VMs, and now I'm actually going, and they installed Docker on those VMs. And those containers now have been connected. Iris is being installed on them. We're pulling down the Iris image, and it will configure those and knit them together. This is a master and some shards. It will do all the Iris admin behind the scenes to make that work. And there we go. At the end, it gives me the address, and off I go and connect to that. So that's great. We've built it, we've used it, and I'd imagine most people are going to use this in a test dev type thing to get their feet wet, to understand it, before you finally get to production. What we're talking about here is how you do get to that point. But if you're putting this stuff in the cloud especially, you're starting to pay as soon as that's all up there. So the important thing is that we can actually pull that down again. So that's just as easy. We've got our 3 VMs. And when it did the provisioning, it actually popped out a little command there, which I'm going to go up and copy and paste. And when this VM set got created, there was some state files created as well. And those state files keep a record of what was deployed, where it was, those type of things. And so it uses those state files to go out now and, in this case, delete the VMs and delete the storage that was associated with them. Now, if you were up in the cloud, it would just pull all your cloud stuff down. So now you're not paying for it anymore. So it's great for this test dev way of working where you can minimize your costs. So the great question is, okay, so where do I start? What's the first thing I should do? How do I make this really happen? We have documentation, and the documentation is great, but it doesn't, it's not, it's got all the features and functionality, but you really need to, what I want to show you is just like a quick start and easy. So as you leave here, you've got something to go away with. So you've got some, on point 1 here, we've created an application image, and I'm just using a plain Iris install. What you guys are probably going to do is have Iris, and you're going to layer your application on top. So what your container is going to have is not just Iris, but your hospital system or whatever it is that you're deploying there. We've got some templates. So these are definition files written in JSON, which are human readable, but the important thing is they just define the environment. Things like how many CPUs, how many disks, how many masters, how many shards, how many mirrors, whatever it is I'm deploying. And then we run the ICM container. It reads those files and it deploys to wherever our target is, doesn't matter which cloud or which vSphere or whatever. Yes?
I just wanted to add also that, because we started with the previous slide, how do we start, where do we go to learn? We also have learning.intersystems.com, and if you search there for cloud and containers, there's a full experience that you can run through with the InterSystems Cloud Manager. We actually spin up a little environment for you with a little editor, so you can go and play inside the JSON definitions files and then see what happened. And we provision whatever you define inside a Google Compute Engine. So it's a great way to get started with before you even download the ICM container.
Thanks. That's why Luca's here, because I just forget stuff. So you obviously need to understand your environment, so you need to know how to configure that Docker image. You're going to have to be a little bit familiar with Docker. Now, when I started this, I'll be honest, I knew what Docker was, but I had no idea how to use it properly. I hadn't really used it in anger for anything. And it's not that difficult to get started with. If you run a Mac or a PC, you can download it. You can do online courses, but the concepts are pretty simple. And as far as ICM goes, you don't really have to know an awful lot because it's all most of it's done for you. But it is deployed on a Docker image. So you do need to install Docker first, wherever you're going to deploy it, and then you can go from there. Like I said, we have online manuals, we have the learning services, so the information is there. The challenge is always, there's a lot of information, just understanding, where do we get started? So what have we got to do? We have to pick an ICM server, and for that you're going to have to consider if it's going to be up in the cloud, Do you want it up there? You could run it from your laptop, but once you start doing things just on your laptop, how do you do that as work as a team doing that? It's fine for proof of concept and playing around, but once you start to do this in production with test and dev and developers and so on, things get a little bit more difficult. We have to prepare the server, so wherever we're going to be running ICM from, we have to configure it. So I run mine from a Red Hat server, not my laptop, just because that's nice and close to where I'm deploying things, and it's a place I know is not going to get dropped and get Coke spilt on the keyboard or anything. You might have to do some configuration of firewalls and things to open some ports, but the main thing is you install Docker, and then you pull the ICM image. So it's a container, and you pull it from a repository. Now, you can get it from the WRC download page at the moment, and probably in future, perhaps other repositories. But for now, that's where it is. And of course, then we just run ICM. So this idea of where do I run it from? Now, if there's, for a proof of concept, you can just use your laptop, but you may need a Bastion server if there's security. I see a few people nodding their heads, like they've obviously been caught out by this before. So I'm going to emulate using a Bastion server, so I'm just going to run on a Red Hat server that I just happen to have in Sydney. So here we go through the deployment process. So I'm on my server called Fremantle. Any Australians in the room? Okay, there's a little joke there. There's a football team called the Fremantle Dockers. So I have Docker installed. It's the 1806 community version. I've got a couple of versions here. I was running, like I said, I was playing around with Python and a few other things on the server. I log into repository, and then I will download. So I do a Docker pull that just says, get this image from the repository and bring it down to this server. And the other thing is with containers, they're like a layer cake that it might be Ubuntu operating system at the bottom and then layered applications and programs and things on top. So there's different layers to it, but ultimately it all comes down, and here we are, it's sitting there ready to go. So that was it. That was installing ICM. That part's pretty straightforward. So what got just installed? I had Docker, I pulled down the image, and also remember, so this image has everything you need. It's got a samples file with examples for you to use, but I'd make the point they are just samples. You will have to make some changes. It's got this thing called Terraform already installed inside it. Who's heard of Terraform before? Most, or half the room. And there's also scripts and helper files and things built in that the ICM developers have put into that container. So basically everything's there. Batteries are included, but I heard someone say, but you can change the batteries. So this is set up to go with samples, but for production, you're going to really have to make some changes. So as a sidebar, Terraform is an open source project from a company called HashiCorp. You can buy an enterprise type license, I think, which comes with more management functionality. But that's the engine of ICM. That's the secret sauce. That's what's inside doing the provisioning. So Terraform is also driven by JSON and scripts, and it allows you to provision in all these different clouds and places as well. So what we've done is we put a wrapper around. So based on the, hi Steve. Based on what we put in the JSON files to tell us what to deploy, it will actually go out and write the files for Terraform, but it also takes care of all the iris stuff as well. So, but that's what's inside. Now, as you go to production, you may find that you want to extend things. And it is possible that you may want to, in fact, go and look at the Terraform files that are created, and you may want to make some changes of your own. Okay, so we get back to this idea of infrastructure as code. And what does that really mean? It just means that instead of describing your infrastructure in an Excel spreadsheet or something stuck to the sysadmin's wall, it's actually now some files, some JSON files, which describe the servers, which describe what your storage is going to be, describe your network layout. So when you have a look inside an ICM container in the samples directory, you'll see a bunch of folders, and we're going to have a look at this one here, the vSphere one, which has got just 2 files in it, defaults.json and definitions.json.
I was going to add a couple of things, Murray. So the third way to try to start off with is also that you saw that we have samples for AWS, samples for GCP, sample for Azure, for VMware, as the example that Murray is taking us through, and we also have one for pre-existing. What does that mean? It means if you just have nodes that are there, it could be bare metal, VMs, and you have an IP address and SSH connectivity, we can provision InterSystems service there. And so by just browsing the samples, you get an idea of the way we operate. Of course, documentations and the learning services site with the course is also very helpful. I was going to add that one of the ideas of offering you InterSystems Cloud Manager in a container was that so that you don't have to install anything. You don't have to go to this site to download Java and this one for Terraform and get this environment variables, and an hour later you're still there, not sure if the environment is set up correctly. This way is just a Docker pull, as you saw in the video that Murray ran, and the environment is set up, is ready for you with samples as well, and you're ready to go. Of course, there's a lot of details, as Murray is telling us now. So like you have to make sure you create your SSH key, and you use your TLS certificates, because we have secure connectivity to the clouds. But there is an environment that allows you to be effective straight away.
So one of the key things when you start to work in teams and you're starting to put this into production, you've taken it beyond the proof of concept, is that you want to have some way of controlling this code. Remember how your servers and everything are defined is now just lines in a file. So I use GitHub, but you can use any source code control system to keep track of these things. The idea is that the infrastructure is not stored on my laptop, it's stored in the central location. Just the same as you would for any other programming. The other key thing is that as we put this together, that the picture here shows a VM, say, running Red Hat, and we've got an ICM container on it. But what's important is to remember that containers are read-only. Or you can write into a container, but it's just temporary space. You delete the container and all that, whatever you wrote just disappeared. So you start up that container again, it's got nothing, that stuff's gone. So we have to keep our anything we change, any of our data outside. And this is the same for your container-based Iris applications. They have to be kept outside the container. So what we do is when we start up Iris is I start up Iris so that it's mounting a file on the file system of the ICM server where all the changeable things are. And we'll revisit this picture in a little while. So what files will we change? So there's an order of precedence that goes as far as these files go. The defaults.json is what it sounds like. It's defaults. So these are things that generally describe your environment. And these will be different depending on where your target is. The vSphere one looks quite different than the AWS one, the Azure one. There's a lot of common things in there, but they're just basically pairs of domain intersystems.com or which network interface or what vCPU, how many vCPUs are going to have for a default. Up the top there, you can see that I'm using a provider called vSphere, and I've got default passwords and so on. So the next level of precedence down is the definitions file. So these override that file, And the next level of precedence after that, or on top of that, is the command line. So, for example, you saw I had a password in there. That's fine for me, just running up test systems for benchmarking or something, but you don't want to be storing that stuff in files. So the documentation has examples of how you manage that type of thing. So in this example, I've got a data master and a couple of shards. So in the master, I've said it's going to have this many CPUs and so on. And for the little stanza at the bottom, which is the data shards, all I've said really is how many of them and what key am I going to use? Because we don't ship InterSystems Iris with keys in it, so we have to tell it where the keys are. So the bottom one is just going to inherit whatever the defaults were. But I wanted you to understand this order of precedence. Okay, so I'm going to have another little demo here. Right, I go through my workflow. So I've still got my resource group here in vSphere, and I'm going to, what I've created here, so this is a vSphere thing, I created a template VM, and it had some of the Red Hat best practices already set up in that. It's a minimum number of CPUs and so on, because we're going to be changing these as we deploy it. And Fremantle is where I'm running everything from. That's my ICM Bastion server in this case. And it's just a absolute minimum install. You really don't need much just to run ICM. So here I am on that Bastion server. I've got a directory with some files in, and it's a little bit easier to see in a this type of window structure. And I've got a folder there called Global Summit Development. And what that has in it is it's a copy of the samples. And then in the vSphere, we've got our couple of files that I talked about, the defaults in JSON. There's me going like that. It goes a lot faster when you're not in front of an audience. So what am I doing? So I'm editing the definitions file, and I'm just going to change the number of CPUs. So this is infrastructure as code. I'm just changing the way my infrastructure works just simply by making a change to a text file. And being a good, conscientious DevOps engineer, I'm going to make a change in GitHub and commit it and make a nice, great explanation of what I did and why I did it, and so other people can understand what I've done. But you can understand now too that you could be doing branches, you could be doing all the things that you do in this software-defined world. So if I change into that folder right now on the Bastion server, there is in fact my definitions file, but the change hasn't been made. So I'm going to have to either pull that down if I'm using GitHub, but I'm just going to cheat for this, and I'm going to just copy that file over with FTP. So there we go, that file's changed. So the next thing I'm going to do is just provision that. So I've changed the black screen because this is where I'm going to be running the ICM container. The black screen is the ICM container now. So what I have is a little helper script because you have to start up the container. And that's a Docker run command. So I just have a little script. And what I do is in there is Docker run. I call it ICM. The IT just says I'm going to make it interactive so I can type commands. And I'm mounting my current directory, and I'm going to call it ICM local. So the idea is that that's how the container can see out to the external world through that mount point. And I'm going to, in fact, install that particular iris image, which I've already downloaded, which I've already pulled. So now I'm inside the ICM container, and I changed to that folder because I want to be where the definitions files are. You can actually, on the command line, set a flag and say the definitions files are on a particular path, but just for a demo, it's easy to be in the same directory. Okay, same file. So same file outside and inside. Takes all the excitement out of demos when they're recorded, doesn't it? Maybe I should have put like some Easter eggs of things bursting into flames.
So those shards, when this is done, they're connected to VM. It's like they're configured in a where VM. It's all done.
So the question was, when this is finished, is the shards just connected to the VM to the master? And yes, that's the whole point of this. You know, this is it takes away all that plumbing and all that manual work away from you, and also you know it's done right. You know, how many times do you forget to click that box or spend an hour futzing around because some security setting wasn't what you thought it was? You know, so yeah, that's exactly it. You know, I bought one chocolate koala bear for the best question, and so you're the first question, which is... Unfortunately, it was next to my laptop, so it's a bit soft. So. All right. So this is a picture of what we just saw. I've got the config files and source code control. I edited them. Somehow they got up there to that other green place. When we start running things, we're also going to create some state files. Now, state files are log files and also a record of what was deployed. So that's very important because, remember I destroyed stuff? To destroy something, I have to know what I put there in the first place. So those state files, once again, are outside the container, and you want to be backing those up because if something happened to that VM, then you've got no record of what's out there and been deployed. So this should be another thing you should be aware of, that these files are written and that they're important. Okay, so that's fine for me to deploy just something nice and simple like ICM, but really you guys want to deploy applications. You want to deploy your application. So this is a really trivial example, but this is how Docker works. So I've taken from that InterSystems Iris image, I've added, remember it's a layer cake? I've added another layer of, I've installed a utility called systat because when I was doing benchmarks, I wanted to run IOstat and it wasn't actually part of that particular image that I was using. So that's how easy it is though. I don't want to run that command every time I fire up that container. So I just build a new image and I called it Docker build and I called it InterSystems Iris systat rather than the 2018.1.2. So this is trivial and there's other sessions later that tell you how to go about building your own applications. But I just want you to get that idea that this is the next step. And then when we're deploying using ICM, we wouldn't be deploying the InterSystems Iris base image, we'd be deploying your base image. So to summarize the things I've talked about so far, before I hand over to Luca, is you've got to decide how you're going to work. So you've got to find a place where you're going to run ICM from. You're going to need a source code control system once the team gets bigger than one. You're going to have to save the state outside your container because remember containers, when they go away, everything else within them goes away. And this is just the start. I really wanted to just give you a place to start to get your leg up. The documentation is full of the functionality and features that doesn't matter what your target is. So really, what else do I need to know? This is where I hand over to Luca for the hard part.
Sure. Thanks, Mario. That was great. So I wanted to know if any of you were at Global Summit last year and tried the Experience Lab on ICM. Anybody last year? Okay, so a couple at the back. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, Marty's gone into some more details of the ingredients of ICM, which is good. Like what about the state file? What about my definition files, they're inside the container, we know they're ephemeral. How do you deal with those things? But of course, there's other general, let's say, cloud consideration that we need to have, right? And so, the first one is, well, the world is going to be full of hybrid type of clouds. So I've got some stuff on-prem, and I want to extend that because maybe I have some particular workload that I wanna spin up, for a few hours, maybe a week, every week. So I don't want to provision and buy specific hardware. I just want to go on the cloud and do it. Maybe test some, ML model. So one of the things that we need to remember is that, we do, all the major cloud providers support VPN connectivity. Okay, so it's just a flag, maybe you pay a little bit for that, but it gives you the extra flexibility and, of having this secure channel between your on-prem site and your public virtual private cloud. And so, of course, within that, it's interesting to know that, ICM then can be used to provision, on-prem, like Mario just showed you, against the vSphere, but you can also do provisioning through the VPN pipe into the public cloud. So that's just, generic consideration about cloud is more than anything else. The other thing that's worth mentioning, this is supposed to be an advanced session on ICM, is that we can also provision specific nodes that have nothing to do with InterSystems Iris. So I might just want to have a normal node, a VM, an instance in the cloud. What could that be for? Anything you want, I mean, literally. So it could be, a beachhead that's the only one that's got public IP versus something else that you might want to, provision and work with. Because we're working with containers, the other thing that you can do is create instances that are actually parts of the containers network overlay that we have with InterSystems Iris. So because we spin up containers, instead of installing InterSystems Iris instances, we have to put an overlay network on all the nodes so that we can communicate between the containers, and it's encrypted. It's very safe and everything. But if I want to just spin up even a simple cache instance somewhere else and connect to the InterSystems Iris, you can't see it. So you have to be part of that network overlay that is laid out for you. So you can do that as well with ICM. The other point that's on the slide is about centralized services, because sometimes we rely so much on everything that I have with InterSystems Iris. The reality is when you start going into the cloud, you realize that everything is a service. And so the idea of using, for example, open LDAP for not just the typical user credentials, but you can use it for anything that you want. Really, it's just a directory of information. And attached to that, with version 2 of ICM, we actually support service discovery. We've implemented Console. So it's just a centralized, highly available, distributed holder of information that you might need for anything. So I want to know where a particular application that I have in the cloud is. I want to know the IP address and the port number that are open on the shard master, for example. You can put everything there. The other useful feature that we built into the service discovery with version 2 ICM is that we had an example first. Mario was saying, what happens if my machine goes down? I even lose the state, the state directory of ICM. Well, with service discovery, we can pick up ICM on another machine and connect. As long as you got the TLS certificate, you can connect directly to your public cloud and say, hey, can you tell me what you have out there? How many shards do you have, and how many application servers, and how is that? Is the InterSystems Iris configured? You have everything. So basically we download everything from the service discovery, and we have auxiliary extra ICMs, InterSystems Cloud Managers, instances that can connect and handle and manage the system. And of course, the last point are just the three big issues or problem that always the three Ys of cloud, latency and the locality of the data. Just because ICM very quickly can provision on another region, it doesn't mean that legally, you can do that with the data that you're dealing with, if it's an hospital or particular other entity that you're working with. So that's just general cloud consideration that we have to think about it. Just because it's easy to define things in the JSON definition, it doesn't mean that you can just go out there and do things. And we had an earlier presentation on Docker container, and we had a representative from Partners Healthcare in Boston, that Diane, who is here today, and she said, one of the interesting things is that it's so easy to just define everything, and ICM is very flexible. The point is, I had to pull people from the network team, from the security team, because we are working together to define how we want our cloud instances working. And so that's the point of the slide. Just because it's easy, it needs some coordination within the departments or your DevOps team that you have in the company.
So where do you get it? The WRC download page has ICM. And finally, can you complete your survey? It seems there's a new competition at this conference, which is to find the survey page. So once you've found it, please let us know what you thought, and because we do use that information. And with that, thank you very much.